Thanks very much, Rob. It's great to be here. I've got a bit of jet lag, so if I fall over, please somebody just prop me up again. I'm also suffering a bit from Brexit fatigue as well. Yeah. So it's good to get away and come to Trumpland to actually problems instead. It's great also that this festival's organised at Columbia as well, because as you already know, I'm sure, Cornell Woolrich did study here, although he didn't finish his degree, so it's not a great example, perhaps. But also I found out that lots of other people involved with Woolrich's screen career came from, studied at Columbia as well. So Saul Siegel, producer of Street of Chance, he studied journalism here, like Woolrich. And so too did Val Luton, the producer of The Leopard Man. And William H. Pine, who produced Fear in the Night, the 1947 film, he also studied at Columbia, but I don't know what he studied. He probably wasn't journalism. So there are quite a lot of coincidences, and of course coincidence is a big thing with Cornell Woolrich, so I'm quite glad about that. So I'm going to be talking today about Woolrich Noir and the B film. As you can see, Woolrich Noir has got scare quotes around it, and you might want to think about why that is. The term noir tends to be added to anything nowadays, you know. So yeah, veteran noir, fish noir, whatever, you know. So I'm a bit sceptical about this kind of bizarre drift.
Would you please raise the mic?
Raise the mic. Hi, Meg. Okay, give a toast to the mic. Is that okay? Is that better? It sounds very, if those of you who've talked already, it sounds very sibilant. You can't quite tell. Okay? All right, so let me start the talk proper. So in his recent book, Reinventing Hollywood, David Bordwell describes 1940s American cinema as, and I quote, a vast storytelling ecosystem that was bursting with compulsive energy, its formal and narrative experimentation recasting the entire Hollywood tradition. He effectively sees the 1940s as a kind of crucible for a lot of what follows. And he says it was an era in which ambitious filmmakers played with scrambled time schemes, shifting points of view, direct address, and other breaks with 1930s norms of linear, objective, seamless storytelling. And of course, a lot of this, as you already have seen, applies very well to Cornell Woolrich. And critics have most often recognised these achievements via the concept of film noir, a term Bordwell interestingly mostly avoids using. And you may want to think about why that is. I think perhaps it's because the term has been so routinely abused, and also perhaps because he wants to cast his net more widely. He's not just concerned with what we might consider film noir, but he's seeing the 1940s innovations as exceeding film noir itself. He does, however, highlight the importance of what he terms murder culture. And he says murder culture motivates many of the period's distinctive narrative and stylistic innovations. And as he stresses, murder culture was by no means restricted to cinema, but saturated American entertainment media through the 1940s. A 1944 article in the trade journal Box Office, over there, pointed to a phenomenal boom in mystery fiction, with healthy sales for original editions from publishers like Simon & Schuster and Doubleday, as well as for paperback reprints as well. The article says that 1 out of every 4 books published was a mystery story. And their readership encompassed businessmen, housewives, children, and even President Roosevelt. God knows what children did with Cornell Woolrich, for Christ's sake. Also, beyond publishing, mystery, crime and horror stories proliferated on the radio as well. In a 1944 article in the New York Times Magazine, John K. Hutchins suggested that 30 network stations in New York City alone carried 30 crime shows a week. That's a lot of crime. And Ken Crossan, founder of the Mystery Writers of America, suggested that 4 to 5 mystery and detective shows were broadcast every day in 1946. Each of them, he says, reaching approximately 10 million listeners. That's a lot of people listening to crime. And of course, suspense was a key feature of this extraordinary boom in murder culture, not only as an integral component of nearly all crime stories, but also as a subgenre in its own right. And Woolrich wasn't the only writer to specialise in psychological suspense, but he was exceptionally prolific and especially prominent in his contribution to murder culture. His anxiety-driven plotting migrated from pulp magazines to hardback novels, to paperback reprints and anthologies, to radio and to cinema. So he crossed the whole field, basically, across the whole kind of media field in disseminating his kind of brand of suspense fiction. And from 1940 to 1954, at the heyday of classic film noir, Hollywood based 18 films on Woolrich properties, with over 70 radio dramas produced during the same period. The radio programs offer a good indication of his phenomenal popularity, and they undoubtedly influenced Hollywood's embrace of his work. Radio not only reached bigger audiences than the movies, but as Baldwin suggests, it was a vast platform for disseminating new storytelling techniques. As you can see from this chart, Woolrich's presence on radio takes off in earnest in 1943, it peaks in 1946 and continues at full strength until 1949. So the blue is the radio adaptations and the red or the orange is the film, and there's basically a sort of a similar sort of shape to each of those kind of like chart set. And besides crime and mystery series like Suspense and Molly Mystery Theatre, which adapted Woolrich a lot, his stories also reached the airwaves when the film versions were adapted by programs like Lux Radio Theatre, This Is Hollywood, and Screen Guild Theatre. Having seen, as some of you did, The Black Angel yesterday, the first attempt to do The Black Angel was actually on television. A year before The Black Angel was made into a film, there was this very early television adaptation, which I don't think a lot of people know about. February 1945, a live TV series in 4 parts, which adapted The Black Angel in the Dr. Death strand on New York station WMBT. And of course, very few people had televisions at that stage, and only the elite could afford it. But I was really glad to find this kind of picture of the production of this live drama. And besides dramatising Woolrich's tales, often very effectively, the radio programmes also promoted his status as a suspense auteur, evoking his authorship as a mark of quality. And I've got some examples of how Woolrich was plugged on some of these radio programmes.
Our story tonight is guaranteed to frighten you, to leave you 25 minutes from now cold with horror. Our author has been called the modern Edgar Allan Poe. Most of you are familiar with his works, both here on the Mystery Playhouse and on many of the suspense programs which you hear each week. His name is Cornell Woolrich. Our story tonight is from the pen of the master mystery writer, William Irish. The author needs no introduction. All of you who died in the World mystery fans are familiar with hard-writing, fast-moving William Irish tales.
And so with the performance of Mr. Donlevy as Bill Scott in the Cornell Woolrich bestseller, The Black Path of Fear, we again hope to keep you in suspense.
And now with Nightmare, one of the best-known and most imaginative short stories of Cornell Woolrich, writing as William Irish, and with our star, Eddie Bracken, we again hope to keep you in suspense.
Tonight's script for The Hunters was based on Cornell Woolrich's famous short story and was produced and directed by Tony Leader.
So by the mid-40s, Woolrich was a high-profile author of crime fiction whose name, or rather names, because obviously, as you know, he wrote under several, including William Irish, but those names guaranteed a distinctive blend of intrigue, atmosphere, and suspense, even if in the USA he was denied the literary respectability accorded Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and James M. Cain. He wrote a great deal more quickly, and often a great deal more carelessly than his other noir auteurs. A Woolrich story propels the reader on an agonisingly suspenseful emotional ride, at times ejecting reason and plot consistency to tantalise with his own strange and compulsive logic. His characters are existentially isolated figures who suffer all-consuming paranoid nightmares, their grip on reality dislocated through amnesia, hypnosis, drugs, mental disorder, morbid obsessions, unfathomable conspiracies, or labyrinthine plots, or sometimes all of them together. Woolrich conveys the anguish and incomprehension of such characters via writing that's painfully vivid and often unhinged. Jonathan Rosenbaum observes that perhaps no other writer handles suspense better or gives it the same degree of obsessional intensity. Or as Raymond Chandler put it, Although Woolrich was the best idea man among contemporary crime writers, you have to read him fast and not analyse too much. He's too feverish. And many films adapted from his fiction try to emulate the feverish and hallucinatory mood of the source material. This strand of film noir was fervently embraced, like Woolrich himself, by Parisian critics. In the first book-length study of the topic in 1955, Raymond Baudelaire and Chometon enthused about the oniric tendencies of certain noir films and the quality of strangeness they could provoke. Woolrich certainly fits the bill here, the paranoia, fatalism and downright absurdity of his fiction, evoking the marriage of surrealism and Kafka that for Baudelaire and Chometon spawned film noir. And we can of course dispute that heritage, but that's how they like to see it. Now, with the exception of films like Murder My Sweet, Dark Passage, or Lady from Shanghai, the oniric tendency found its most fertile territory in low-budget movies like The Stranger on the Third Floor, Detour, or independent productions such as The Chase. There were clearly economic incentives at play, as it was possible to create striking effects at relatively low cost, with dream and hallucination sequences or shadows and eccentric angles deputizing for more lavish production values. So this kind of oniric tendency becomes a kind of low-budget production value. And several Woolrich adaptations, like Phantom Lady, Night as a Thousand Eyes, and No Man of Her Own, were major studio productions equipped with reasonable budgets, but Woolrich proved especially attractive to producers of low-budget fare. Besides offering scope for oniric pizzazz, his fiction could also be obtained at bargain basement rates. For example, Warner Brothers purchased the screen rights to Chandler's The Big Sleep for $10,000, and MGM bought The Lady in the Lake for $35,000. By contrast, the movie rights to Woolrich's The Black Curtain was sold to Paramount for $2,225, pretty cheap. While Black Alibi, Phantom Lady, and the After Dinner Story collection fetched roughly $5,000 each. So, you know, anyone wanting to make an interesting film from an author who was gaining a lot of traction, Woolrich is the man to go to. And of the 17 films adapted from Woolrich's suspense fiction from 1938 to 1950, over half were low-budget enterprises. The B-movie, though, it's worth stressing, was not a stable and uniform category during this period. For example, The Window, based on Woolrich's story The Boy Cried Murder, was made at a comparatively low cost of $210,000 and had a brisk running time of 73 minutes. But it played the top half of double bills and was a critical and commercial success. The film emerged during Dory Sherry's brief tenure as RKO production chief, when he initiated a policy of low-budget quality pictures, among them Crossfire, Nicholas Ray's first feature, They Live by Night, and Robert Wise's The Setup. In a 1947 Variety article entitled Don't Tag 'Em as Bees, Sherry challenged the assumption that quality filmmaking and low budgets were mutually exclusive. The following year, Variety scribe Herb Golden suggested that a new era of bees that aren't bees may be at hand, arguing that the success of films like Boomerang and Crossfire was encouraging several studios to go for low-cost films with distinctive story values, especially themes that were provocative or realistic. The strategy was a response to various crises facing cinema, triggered in particular by sharply declining audiences and rising production costs. As I'll suggest, the cinema industry experienced considerable transformations through the 1940s that made traditional budgetary distinctions less reliable as a guide to a film's status and profitability. The question posed by Golden's article, when to be, not to be, is equally applicable, I think, to developments earlier in the decade as well. Even so, the B-film was an appropriate context for Woolrich, as it was the cinematic equivalent of the pulp magazines in which he honed his expertise as a suspense writer. The first such film, though, was hardly an auspicious start. It was based on a black mask story called Facework from 1937. And Convicted appeared before Woolrich's transition to book-length fiction, suspense fiction in 1940 with The Bride Wore Black. So it's before he started getting this kind of prestigious reputation, such as he had. Convicted gets a very bad rap from later critics and also from contemporary reviewers. Harrison reports rightly observed that the production looks cheap, the story is trite, and the acting does not help matters much. It's a very early Rita Hayworth outing, and it's one of 12 B movies made in Victoria, British Columbia, by Central Films, a Canadian company run by Kenneth J. Bishop that was affiliated with Columbia Pictures. And it was basically an outsourcing ruse, because during this time there was a quota restriction imposed in Britain through the 1927 Cinematographer Films Act to safeguard domestic production. But films that were made in Australia or in Canada or the British Dominions generally were allowed to pass without any kind of hindrance in the British markets. So Columbia came up the whiz-bang idea of, hey, let's make these films in Canada and then we can get them, smuggle them into Britain easily. So Convicted actually retains many plot elements from Woolrich's story, but as the Film Data Reviewer noted, this formula gangster picture lacks tension and production finesse. And 4 years later, Street of Chance proved to be a very different proposition, but before I discuss this film, which is, I'll show you a clip from it as well, let me flesh out the broader context of the B film to try and clarify some of the issues affecting the production of such films in the 1940s. And of course, there is a great deal of confusion about exactly what a B movie is. Especially about the B-movie's relationship to film noir. At one extreme is the assumption that all noir films were B films, which ignores the fact that Double Indemnity, The Big Sleep, Mildred Pierce and many others were major studio productions with high budgets and top-line talent. The persistence of this myth, I think, derives from a tendency to regard both film noir and the B film as outlaw enterprises that implicitly or explicitly challenge the Hollywood mainstream. And this too is inaccurate. B films were an integral feature of Hollywood cinema from the early 30s to the early 1950s. They were especially crucial to the success of Universal and Columbia, who were like the poor relations of the major companies, as well as to minor league companies like Republic, Monogram, and Producers Releasing Corporation, or PRC. So B-film production flourished with the emergence of the double bill in the 1930s, which was a strategy to lure back Depression audiences with the value for money incentive of 2 films for the price of 1. First-run theatres in metropolitan centres initially resisted the double bill, but elsewhere it proved increasingly popular. By mid-1932 it was a norm in 40% of theatres, increasing to 86% in 1936. And of course this creates a great demand for films. The 5 vertically integrated majors set up dedicated B units, but they couldn't supply enough product to service the market, so smaller producers had to make up the numbers. And subsequent run or neighbourhood theatres, the backbone of the cinema business, also relied on B product from both the major studios and the smaller companies, as well as A films that completed their first run engagements. Now earlier on you saw Fall Guy, and you may have noticed there's an interesting scene in Fall Guy which is set in one of those neighbourhood cinemas basically. It's showing just Monogram product. Well, a bit of product placement there for you. So this we have here the film that's being shown is Decoy, which was a kind of one of Monogram's Woolrich-like suspense films from 1947, I think. And the lobby is also adorned with posters for the Monogram films Wife Wanted and Don't Gamble with Strangers. So this is the kind of cinema that, away from the first run, where a lot of the kind of B products would have played. And so it's an interesting little kind of like a nod to Monogram's basic constituency, if you like. And despite their subordinate status, it's worth remembering that B films far outnumbered A movies. There are many more B films than A films during the 30s and 40s. Brian Taves estimates, for example, that roughly 75% of all US feature films made in the 1930s were B movies. He also points out that not all B films were created equal. There were substantial differences in budgets, resourcing and shooting schedules between films produced by B units at the major companies, B films produced by larger independents like Monogram and Republic, and the impoverished quickies from fly-by-night Poverty Row outfits. Complicating the picture still further were major studio programmers, medium-budget films that played in some territories as A's and other territories as B movies. And films from other providers might also play the bottom half of a double bill in major cinema chains while topping the bill in neighbourhood theatres. And this creates a very complicated map of, what the hell is a B movie? What do we do with this concept? B movies then were extremely popular, but many B films are actually not. And so while audiences loved going to see 2 films for the price of 1, they often groaned at the bottom half of a double bill, and cinema owners especially complained about the inferior B product foisted on them by the major companies. The film majors used block booking to coerce exhibitors into taking all their films irrespective of quality. So if an independent theatre owner wanted, say, the latest Clark Gable feature, they could only get it if they signed up for the season's entire package of MGM releases, sight unseen. So it wasn't just a question of like, you've got to take all these films. You're not going to know necessarily what they are or what they're going to be like, and whether your audiences will go for them. So independent exhibitors lobbied the federal government to abolish such restrictive trade practices, and in July 1938, the Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit against the major distributors. And the five majors feared that a court case could force them to sell their lucrative theatre division. So they came up with a compromise, which is known as the consent decree. And the consent decree was an attempt to kind of say, hey, look, we're going to restrain our anti-competitive tactics, we're going to be good boys here, so let's forget about going to court. And the October 1940 consent decree required the majors to limit the size of blocks to 5 films, and also that they had to guarantee trade showings of new product to exhibitors. It didn't fully resolve the problems confronting exhibitors, but the consent decree did loosen the major companies' control a little and created a much more competitive climate. It also served to enhance the importance of originality and distinctiveness in B movies as well as in A films. So each film had to be sold on its merits, no longer as part of a big block. Now, the consent decree was rendered invalid in June 1942 when Universal, Columbia and United Artists refused to sign it. But what's interesting is that 5 majors chose not to resume their earlier practices. They didn't go back to these massive kind of 4-season blocks. MGM actually did increase the size of its blocks, but only to 10 films. Warner Brothers abandoned block booking altogether in 1943, while Paramount, 20th Century Fox and RKO stuck with blocks of 5. So besides aiming to mollify the Justice Department, there were also other incentives here as well, I think. By abandoning large-scale block booking, the majors were able to develop alternative production policies that proved extremely profitable during the wartime boom in cinema attendance. They cut back on production volume, especially low-budget movies, to focus on more costly films that played for longer in first-run houses. So there's a major shift in the whole kind of production strategy of the major companies, and this was largely helped by not just the consent decree, but also the fact that attendance skyrocketed during the war years. And reduced competition from the majors' B units boosted the fortunes of Columbia, Universal, and independent producers as well. Besides finding increased exposure for their low-budget films, these companies were also able to upgrade the quality of their higher-end movies. Motion Picture Herald reported in June 1943 that A films produced by all companies were enjoying unparalleled success in first and second run theatres, with even Monogram, Republic and PRC securing longer playdates for top budget features and increased turnover for B movies. So everybody was happy about this. And the films were better as well. Whereas the majors equated quality with lavish budgets and pre-sold properties, the smaller companies sought other ways to make their films competitive in the post-consent decree wartime environment. And Cornell Woolrich, I would suggest, offered one means of achieving this. So back to Woolrich. Now, those who've been waiting patiently can get through the big of this stuff. We're going to get back to Woolrich. So this was the first Cornell Woolrich adaptation of the 1940s, and the first one is really considered, obviously, to be a film noir. It was made for less than $230,000, based on Woolrich's second suspense novel, The Black Curtain. And the film exemplifies the enhanced ambitions of many B films in the consent decree era. It was actually part of Paramount's second 5-film block of the 1942-43 season. It lacked the the appeal and the stature of the block's star attractions, the Hope and Crosby vehicle Road to Morocco, and a Technicolor adventure, The Forest Rangers. But it was a cut above the other B films in the block, the 4th screen version of Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. Has it never seen Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch? Or the other 3 versions? And the other B film in the block was and the 4th entry, I think, in the Henry Aldrich series, which is based on a radio sitcom. As was common with low-budget fare, Streets of Chance received dismissive reviews from metropolitan critics who nearly always saw themselves above such low-rated stuff. Although the New York Times' Bosley Crowther noted its deep-shadowed, brooding mystery style, but that wasn't a compliment for him, unfortunately. But other reviewers, in the trade reviewers, who welcomed this film as an intriguing and accomplished suspense thriller. And there's always an interesting divide between what the metropolitan critics like and what the trade reviewers see as the models of successful films. And besides its individual merits, Streets of Chance also enhanced the overall attractiveness of the Paramount block. Like several other Woolrich adaptations, the film focuses on a central character who faces a crisis of identity owing to memory loss. You're going to probably forget all the films you've seen over the last few days as well. There's so much amnesia floating around. And amnesia was by no means at this time a novelty in films, nor was it exclusive to film noir, but it did emerge as a compelling feature, a compelling motif in 1940s crime thrillers. Amnesia motivated many of the era's characteristic storytelling innovations and allowed films to capitalise on the vogue for popular psychoanalysis by foregrounding identity as a narrative enigma. In this film, Burgess Meredith plays Frank Thompson, who's knocked unconscious by falling masonry as he strolls along a New York street. I know this happens every day in New York. When he comes to, he discovers that for the past year he's been living under a different identity, Danny Nearing, but has no memory of why and how this came about, nor of what he's been doing during the missing year. As he seeks to fill in the gap in his memory, Thompson is pursued by mysterious assailants. He also discovers that as Nearing, he is involved with a beautiful blonde, played by Claire Trevor, despite being married in his former identity, and that as Thompson, he's a prime suspect in a murder case. So he's not having a very good day, this guy. So where convicted lacks conviction in the scenarios it dramatises, Street of Chance successfully generates an aura of perpetual uncertainty. The film tinkers considerably with the plot of the novel in its latter stages, but it maintains Woolrich's paranoid mood and his twisty surprises. In the absence of a large budget, it achieves this, as many trade reviewers suggest, by skillful writing, direction, and performance. It may not be as flamboyant as later oniric thrillers, like The Chase, but Street of Chance is enlivened by some deft touches, such as a sequence where the paranoid Thompson can't shake the memory of being pursued by the menacing Sheldon Leonard. So I've got a clip from this film, because it's not in the festival. It's also very hard to see, so I thought you might like to see a taste of this very first example of Woolrich noir.
Frank, I said you didn't have any trouble remembering today. I mean, people and things. The way they were before you went away. Did you?
Not a bit.
Well, that's good. I'm sure you'll be able to recall what happened in that other time.
I hope you're right.
So lovely, huh? How would you like to take a little stroll somewhere? Or maybe go to a picture, huh?
No, I don't want to go anywhere tonight.
All right.
So just a taste there of Street of Chance. If you get a chance, it's worth catching up with that sometime. Anyway, the following year saw the release of another B-movie adapted from a Woolrich novel, 1942's Black Alibi. The Leopard Man in 1943 was the third film from Val Lewton's B unit at RKO, following the phenomenally successful Cat People and I Walk with a Zombie, all directed by Jacques Tourneur. The film was produced for around 150,000 and was not as successful as its predecessors. It was mostly attracted its kind of play dates and was mostly restricted to the lower half of double bills, in some territories actually playing as a support to I Walk with the Zombie, whereas both I Walk with the Zombie and Cat People would play as headliners in many places. Bosley Crowther called the film a feeble and obvious attempt to frighten and shock the audience with a few exercises in mayhem. You may like to judge the veracity of his opinion later on yourselves. But it also drew a mixed reception from the trade press, with reviews in Variety and Motion Picture Herald criticising a directionless screenplay and what they saw as deficiencies in characterisation. Later critics, of course, have a much higher opinion of the film. So Manny Farber argued, I don't expect you to read all this, don't worry. Manny Farber argued in 1952 that the very features of this nerve-twitching whodunit, slammed by early reviewers, made it one of Hollywood's original gems. He was impressed by the way it transfers, psychological effects to the film's non-human components, most notably in the killing of Teresa Delgado, and by its shifting character focus. So what confused those earlier critics was appraised by Manny Farber as a really distinctive kind of strategy. And more recently, Chris Fujiwara has acclaimed Leopard Man as a radically unusual film with its own precise, inexhaustible poetry that pushes to extremes the experiment with narrative ambiguity undertaken in Cat People and I Walk with the Zombie. And as you watch the Luton films in sequence, you can see the kind of same techniques being explored in more depth and with more bravado, I think. Luton and his collaborators clearly recognised affinities between their approach to suspense storytelling and Woolrich's fiction, both in terms of structure and a shared investment in what Fujiwara calls the mood of philosophical fatalism. In relinquishing the supernatural, The Leopard Man deviates from the earlier Luton films, but like its predecessors, it generates a creeping sense of dread through carefully orchestrated suspense sequences, or what Luton termed horror spots. And these are assembled through the judicious deployment of sound, lighting effects, compositional strategies, and editing. And Woolrich similarly devises set-piece sequences that build to a crescendo of anguish. But so both Luton and Woolrich are very interested in kind of episodic storytelling. As James Sander observed in 1946, Woolrich has a facility for catching the reader's attention with a striking situation and then bustling him from shock to shock with a kind of numbing swiftness. And many critics have highlighted the flaws in Woolrich's plotting, for example, the way his stories rely upon wild coincidences. But as Mike Nevins suggests, rational narrative plays second fiddle to the conjuring of nightmarish situations. Box Office magazine argued that films like Street of Chance and Leopard Man were actually comparatively rare during the war years, as cinema failed to capitalise on the early 1940s boom in crime, detective and mystery fiction. So 62 such films, they say, were released in 1942, and this drops to 45 the following year. A likely explanation was the pressure exerted on Hollywood by the Office of War Information, which threatened to deny export licenses to crime films that gave an unflattering image of the United States. Box Office insisted that there was a proven demand for this type of movie, urging film companies to increase production of detective mysteries, murder mysteries, and horror stories instead of focusing on million-dollar A pictures with social significance. The magazine estimated that a medium-budget mystery picture could attract 10 to 15 million customers, with such films being especially suited to small-town and rural audiences. And the success of Cat People showed that low-budget thrillers could do good business in first-run houses as well as neighbourhood theatres. In his March 1943 Variety article, Creepy Pigs Cleaning Up, wouldn't you die for a title like that? Jim Cunningham announced that Hollywood was preparing to greenlight further horror films and whodunits. I think it's interesting thinking about the lack of a clear distinction between horror films and thrillers. They were all more or less the same thing. I think the term mystery is often used to cover a kind of range of affiliated genres at the time. So Cat People isn't just a horror film, it's a mystery, it's a thriller as well. So these films were sort of getting a lot of attention in the trade press, and like other commentators, Cunningham ascribes the intense public appetite for such films and the broader cultural fascination with murder and mystery to the increased violence of wartime. He notes too that producers were especially encouraged by the fact that these films could be made cheaply, as they required limited sets and small casts. And if you know the Luton films, you'll know that they make a virtue of their really restricted budgets. And The Leopard Man, of course, was clearly a product of this context, but so too was the B-film series that Columbia Pictures developed from the radio program The Whistler, which one reviewer described as one of the neater pseudo-psychological chilladillas on the air. The second and the final entries, Mark of the Whistler and Return of the Whistler, which is being shown later on, were based on Woolrich stories. But beyond this, the series as a whole had a very strong Woolrich flavour. Even the first film, The Whistler, is really, really Woolrich-like. So the Whistler movies also are the only series films that tend to be included within the film noir canon. And that's because there's always a problem with series movies because the hero has to come back in the next instalment. But the great gimmick of this film is that Richard Dix plays a different character in each instalment. So you don't get this kind of sense that the ending is necessarily going, the ending is going to have to be, the character's going to have to be resurrected for the next film. So the Whistler movies, as I say, the only films included within film noir, and the only character who really recurs across the movies is the Whistler himself, who's this kind of phantom presence, a mysterious, taunting narrator who prowls the nighttime streets in search of strange tales hidden in the hearts of men and women who have stepped into the shadows. So again, very Woolrich-like kind of atmosphere is suggested, I think, by those words. So the first 7 films of the series are built around a recurring star, Richard Dix, rather than a recurring character. And Richard Dix in these films delivers the kind of gnawing anguish that Richard Corliss sees as a hallmark of Woolrich's fiction. And at their best, the Whistler films, especially those directed by William Castle, are moody suspense dramas that combine elements from the radio programme with a low-budget aesthetic indebted to Val Lewton. As I've argued elsewhere, they were an attempt by Columbia Pictures to develop a distinctive product line that enhanced the quality of the B-series provision, their B-series provision following the consent decree. So these Whistler films can be seen again as a response to the consent decree. Now, a few weeks before the release of the first Whistler movie, Universal unveiled a much higher budget Woolrich adaptation that really did boost his reputation as a screen contender. Phantom Lady was published in 1942 as the first novel under the William Irish alias, and it received rapturous reviews. In the Los Angeles Times, for example, Paul Jordan Smith acclaimed the novel's originality and cleverness, arguing that it will rank among the best murder mysteries ever written in America. The novel was a bestseller, its popularity boosted further by its inclusion in Walter H. Black's heavily promoted Detective Book Club subscription service. If anyone knows more about this service, I'd like to know, because it sounds really fascinating. It went on until the 70s, I think. And so the film was directed by Robert Siodmak and released in 1944, and this was also a critical and commercial hit. Among the many rave reviews, Film Daily applauded it as a spellbinding psychological melodrama that was turned out with distinction and intelligence. It claimed the film was a masterpiece of suspense that at times has a positively devastating effect. An article in the Motion Picture Herald identified the film as part of a cycle of what it called upper bracket chillers, along with Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion and Saboteur and the Paramount ghost story The Uninvited. So again here, that lack of distinction between what we see as horror, supernatural, The Uninvited and thrillers. The article also acknowledged that these A-class films built on the way numerous B-movies had demonstrated the public appetite for vicarious excitement. So we've got Woolrich here being pitched into the kind of upper bracket of cinema, which I think is very interesting. The resounding success of Phantom Lady spurred more concerted efforts to translate his work to the screen. In 1945, for example, Paramount producer Buddy De Silva acquired the screen rights to the After Dinner Story collection with a view to using 3 of its stories, The Night Reveals, Rear Window and Marijuana, as the basis for a whodunit script. God knows what kind of script we would have come up with. If you know those stories, how are they going to put over together, my God. Anyway, nothing came of this film, so we'll never know. But Paramount invested in several, it was obviously interested in Woolrich, and invested in several other Woolrich properties, releasing the Pine Thomas B film Fear in the Night in 1947, and producing the A features Night of the Thousand Eyes in 1948 and No Man of Her Own in 1950. And of course, ultimately, De Silva's purchase of After Dinner Story paid off handsomely in 1954 when the studio released Hitchcock's acclaimed version of Rear Window. So Fear in the Night, as the B film that Paramount made. It was produced on a budget of $180,000 and shot in a week. It's a quintessential example of Woolrich noir that generated much excitement in the industry. Several trade reviews tipped it as a potential sleeper hit, praising the film's direction and performances. The Independent Exhibitors Film Bulletin said the film showed how quality films could be made on restricted budgets, suggesting it has the suspense, the pace, and the entertainment value equal to many of its more expensive counterparts. And Daily Variety went so far as to describe the film as one of the best features of the year. The film was a pet project of the writer-director Maxwell Shane. It was his first, he'd worked with the Pine Thomas crew for a long time. This was his first stab at directing, so we wanted to kind of like to impress with this. And Shane was also responsible for the 1956 remake Nightmare, which is screened the other night. The film makes imaginative use of optical printer effects and restricted narrative focus to convey the protagonist's psychological disorientation. And if you did see Nightmare, it is really worth trying to watch Fear in the Night as well. It's interesting the similarities and differences. But I want to conclude by considering the 3 B films that Monogram made from Woolrich stories, 2 of which have been shown today. Monogram was a thinly capitalized company that specialized in quickly made, low-cost films, many of them entries in series, that were aimed at subsequent run and neighborhood theaters. Like other independent producers, it existed on tight margins and faced stiff competition from B units at the major studios. Things improved with the wartime cinema boom and the major companies' retreat from B production after consent decree. And during the war, Monogram was able to strike deals with major league exhibition outlets, placing films in circuits owned by Lowe's Inc., RKO, Warner's, Paramount, and Fox. And besides persevering with series pictures and other B films, the company also took a chance on higher budget pictures that could secure first-run playdates and thus earn percentage deals rather than the fixed flat rental terms that were generally given to the B movies. And company president Steve Broidy described such ambitious films as nervous A's. So these were the kind of higher budget films produced by Monogram. And the most crucial example was Dillinger. This was a key example of the nervous A. Made in 1945, it was produced by the King brothers. And when Monogram films had previously cost at most $75,000 to $80,000, Dillinger was given a production budget of $197,000, so more than twice as much, and a sensational and very expensive promotional campaign. And this helped the film to gross over $4 million worldwide. And there was a lot of industry buzz about this movie. It's the most successful film in Monogram's history thus far. And Broidy got very excited and promised further action movies for the 1945 to 46 season. But the film and its sensational advertising provoked great controversy. In an open letter to the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America in June 1945, the producer-director Frank Borzage urged the organization to block an impending cycle of gangster and crime films, arguing that nothing could do more harm to this country and the movie industry at this particular time. Without specifically identifying Dillinger, Borzage's reference to a highly publicized gangster film recently released left no one in doubt that this was Dillinger as being referred to. There were also reports that several major studios were studying Dillinger avidly to analyse its box office values, so there's a kind of sense of, oh my God, we've got to cash in on what this film is doing. So the MPPDA took action after the parent-teacher associations and other public groups voiced alarm at a potentially forthcoming cycle of violent gang films. In August 1945, the Production Code Administration refused to approve the screenplay of Wanted for Murder, a PRC film about a notorious outlaw couple, Bonnie and Clyde, as well as 3 other films, gangster stories that the company was planning. And the PCA accused Wanted for Murder of violating 10 of the 12 rules laid down in the crime section of the Hays Code. But it stopped short of a blanket ban on crime films. So it didn't want to be too heavy, but it wanted to make sure that it did quell some of these protests. Republic also cancelled several biopics or Prohibition-era gangsters, and Monogram was itself considering a sequel entitled Dillinger's Moll, but cancelled this and similar gang projects it had on the slate. In June 1946, an item in the Independent Film Exhibitors Bulletin declared that Monogram's 1946-47 season would be absolutely free of any censorable product owing to the rising surge of pressure groups. And Broidy also vowed to tone down sensationalism of the company's advertising copy. So, with this public outcry, Monogram was prevented from capitalizing on his really big hit, so it had to come up with other strategies to move forwards. The first thing it tried was Broidy argued that the success of Dillinger showed that Monogram was able to liquidate a $1 million feature, and he embarked on an ambitious plan for a series of high-quality $1 million films, the first of which was this bizarre noir ice skating melodrama, which is great. It was a really great film. This was produced by the King brothers and had a $92,000 advertising campaign. Secondly, Monogram developed a contrasting cycle of low-budget crime films to satisfy the subsequent run market. As well as the 3 Woolrich adaptations, Fall Guy, The Guilty, and I Wouldn't Be in Your Shoes, these included such grubby noir thrillers as Fear, Decoy, Violence, High Tide, and Incident. I like these one-word titles, they're fantastic. Monogram considered had considered adapting Woolrich to screen as early as 1942 when it announced the production of the 1938 story, Dime a Dance, under the title The Blonde Bomber. The company resurrected this idea in 1945 with Lindsley Parsons set to produce a version of Dime a Dance, scripted by Harrison Olkoff, for release in 1945 to 46, but neither film saw the light of day. The trio of Woolrich films it did release were similarly based on short stories, and they clearly sought to piggyback on Woolrich's reputation as a crime writer, and also on the profile of high-budget predecessors like Phantom Lady and Black Angel and Deadline at Dawn as well. In the later interview, Steve Broidy claimed that to keep costs down, Monogram based its films on 95% original material or public domain sources such as Treasure Island or Kidnapped. So the very fact that they were prepared to pay for Woolrich stories showed that they believed he was a sound investment. And as these films use short stories rather than novels, the screen rights were actually comparatively cheap. The first Monogram film, which was shown earlier, Fall Guy, was adapted from the 1940 story Sea-Jag or Cocaine, and Rob King talked about this earlier on. It resembles Fear in the Night in its premise of a man trying to clear himself of a murder he may or may not have committed in a state of mental derangement. This was the first film to be released following a revision of the production code that allowed the depiction of drug addiction on screen. In this respect, it also shares a kinship with Monogram exploitation fare like Where Are Your Children, Divorce, Allotment Wives, and Black Market Babies, which are all taking these very topical issues and making a quickie film to cash in on the sensation. However, as William R. Weaver commented in Motion Picture Daily, nothing has been done with a dope element which could not have been done with drunkenness, amnesia, or even an accidental bump on the head. And this was the first production from Walter Mirisch, who later goes on to much greater things, films like Magnificent Seven and The Apartment. And he later complained that it was severely hampered by PCA interference, which prevented a bolder treatment of the drug theme. But despite such compromises, trade reviewers commended Fall Guy as a tense little melodrama. Produced on a budget of $83,000, it did well enough to allow Mirisch to take on another Woolrich story. But in the meantime, Woolrich had a further Woolrich adaptation in the works, which again was screened earlier on, The Guilty. This was released 2 weeks after Fall Guy, and it was based on a 1941 story, He Looked Like Murder. This tale of tawdry love and vicious murder, as a poster proudly proclaims, was the first production from Texas oil millionaire Jack Rather in an independent deal he negotiated with Monogram. Although several reviewers identified it as a resolutely Class B product, Brody actually promoted the film as one of the more high-budget Monogram releases of 1947. You may wonder, looking at the film, where's the budget gone? Probably to get the wallpaper really dirty. You may have noticed that's the wallpaper ever. So the film wasn't obviously not in the $1 million bracket, but it was probably more lavish than the series offerings Monogram usually specialised in. The film has a shabby and bedraggled look that is suited to subject matter and characters that reviewers routinely described as sordid, trashy, unpleasant, and confusing. Several reviewers regarded this minimalist production and downbeat tone as contributing successfully to the film's uncompromising realism. Though Showman's Trade Review, and I like this bit actually, recommended billing the film as support to a light musical main feature to alleviate the gloom. It's like walking out. I walked after watching The Guilty, I went into the sunshine, and I got the same effect. It's amazing. The Guilty is interesting, I think, because as well as recycling elements from other Woolrich adaptations, it also expands on the original story to incorporate motifs and strategies found across a much wider range of 1940s. Crime films, which were later seen to be characteristic of film noir. These include, obviously, the use of a flashback frame, the inclusion of a traumatized war veteran, a sexually knowing and duplicitous femme fatale who's opposed to a good girl, a sexual obsession theme, the murkily entangled intimate relations between the main characters, an atmosphere of angst and paranoia, a compulsive doubling that plays out through both narrative and imagery, and in a blatant bid to emulate the previous year's hit Dark Mirror, the casting of Bonita Granville as identical twins. So it's an interesting example of using Woolrich to access all these other kind of things that we now think of as noir, that were very much kind of playing out through lots of other movies at the time. The film also has some imaginative cinematographic choices, including 2 attention-grabbing overhead shots. You may have noticed one in the bathroom, some deep shadowed lighting, and an out-of-focus optical POV shot. Its most audacious move, as Rob King points out, though, is the use of an unreliable narrator, who, in a significant change from Woolrich's story, turns out to be the murderer. I think in the original story, wasn't it the pervy lodger who was the killer, I think, yeah? So these are some shots in the film to illustrate aspects of his style. The final Monogram film, which is great, my favourite of these Monogram films, I think, was an adaptation of the 1938 story I Wouldn't Be in Your Shoes, one of several Woolrich tales in which the everyday world spirals into an absurdist and paranoid nightmare. The film was first announced in September 1945 as a King Brothers production. A news item in May 1948 declared it would have the biggest budget of any King Brothers film to date, with Pat O'Brien likely to star. Ultimately, however, the film was produced by Walter Mirisch on a much tighter budget, with Pat O'Brien nowhere in sight. Instead, Steve Broidy used it to launch Don Castle, the main guy in The Guilty, and Elise Knox as a romantic starring team, but it turned out to be the only film in which they played together. The movie was virtually ignored by mainstream critics, but some trade papers gave it the strongest reviews of Monogram's 3 Woolrich films. Sherman's trade review, for example, described it as an exceptionally good mystery and suspenseful dramatic affair that had murder, excitement, and edge-of-the-seat suspense. Box Office similarly praised it as a cleverly contrived, tight-at-all-seams murder mystery that was bound to outshine many of the headline pictures it supported on double bills. Reviewing how films performed across the summer of 1948 in 21 key cities, Box Office magazine suggested that I Wouldn't Be in Your Shoes did 95% of average or normal business. While top products such as Easter Parade performed well at the box office, the magazine noted that lesser features found the going tougher compared to the previous year. And this is really the beginnings of the downward slide in cinema attendance that carries on to the 1970s, basically. The box office figures for a film like I Wouldn't Be in Your Shoes are not necessarily reliable, as they're skewed towards first-run exhibitions, so it doesn't take into account the way these films played in neighbourhood theatres, for example. But even so, the top-performing crime films in first-run circuits in the 1947 to 48 season suggest that other trends were displacing the studio-bound suspense thrillers that made up the majority of Woolrich adaptations. The most successful crime films that year generally followed the location-shot, semi-documentary style initiated after the war, exemplified by films such as 20th Century Fox's Cornell Northside 777 and The Iron Curtain, Columbia's To the Ends of the Earth, and the medium-budget Eagle Lion releases, T-Men and Cannon City. While Woolrich would feature in many television dramas through the 50s, it seems that in cinema at least, murder culture had found other corpses to fry. Okay, thank you very much. So I guess we can take some questions, is that right? I'll MC myself. Don't be shy.
I think I speak loud enough. Why do you think film noir fell out of favor? How come the genre basically stopped?
Well, you mean in the why the films stopped being produced?
Yeah, the whole genre of film noir.
Well, I think
see them today.
Yeah. Well, there are lots. I think there are why did film noir fall out of favour? I think there are lots of reasons. I mean, Paul Kerr in an article on the B Film Noir talks about obviously television and that kind of like the look of TV. If you look at Dragnet and put it alongside some of these deep shadowed films, you've got a very different aesthetic. And also the standardisation of colour as a mark of quality in the 1950s as well. But also like you've got high budget movies doing relatively well in the 50s, and there's still a market for low budget films, but it's not the medium budget films kind of disappear really. So I think it's very complicated, and also I suppose there are social cultural factors as well. Were these necessarily the films that were going to bring audiences to cinemas in the 1950s, for example? So I think it depends what you mean by film noir, and because what you've got loads of films use the kind of semi-documentary style through the 1950s. A lot of exploitation crime films, for example, are kind of still using this semi-documentary style, and crime films never disappeared. But they're marked by maybe different sort of stylistic features, So what we see as film noir is very much a product of a certain period, And there's lots of debates over what that period is. Is it the 40s? Is it the 40s, early 50s? Does it go up until the early 60s and so on? But if you look at films like Harper and Marlowe in the 1960s, they're hip, cool movies that have a very, very different attitude. There's a lot of kind of ironic treatment of the kind of notions of privatised and so on. They become really the idea of the private eye, for example, becomes very much fixed as a product of a certain era of cinema that's no longer current, And then in the 70s, when you get these kind of retro noir, neo noir kind of films, they're very much critiques of Hollywood values, I suppose, really. So it's a big topic, but a lot depends on what you mean by film noir, really. If you think about it, but there are lots of industrial changes, social cultural changes, I think, bring the death knell for it. There's one behind you, I see.
Yeah, just one.
Yeah. I'll come to you in a second, don't worry.
You mentioned the
sorry, we've got the microphone. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Carol.
You mentioned the connection with the war. Can you expand a little on why you think the public was interested in this kind of film with the war going on?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a lot of cultural commentators at the time were trying to kind of think, well, why are these films so successful? It must be due to the way that the war has increased an appetite and awareness of violence, an appetite for violence. But this is safely controlled violence. This is violence that doesn't really kill people, So you can see it as a kind of cathartic experience, maybe. I think that's how a lot of the critics at the time would see in these films, a kind of like safe way to exercise those kind of like negative currents that were being generated by the war itself, I think, So I think it is interesting that across a range of media, there's such a boom in what Baudelaire calls murder culture, unparalleled really, we didn't get anything like it in the 1930s. So there is clearly some kind of connection to what's happening, in terms of America's relationship to World War II, But, you can get vulgar Freudian about this as well, I suppose, as well. But, I think and the facts are undeniable. There is this big boom, the war's going on, so there clearly is some kind of connection, Sorry, and next.
Yes, I was interested in what you said about the change in the production code before create the production of Fall Guy.
Yeah.
And I was goofing around in the Margaret Herrick library, and I read production files of the PCA correspondence, and I think it's interesting that there was that change, and I wondered if you knew any more details, because they actually gave Mirisch a pretty hard time about the film, and there was a lot of back and forth, and it was ironic because they didn't want to include anything about the original story title, Cocaine, but they had to put it in the film for legal reasons. So I was wondering if you knew why they had those problems when the production code had changed.
I imagine when the production code changes, but I imagine they wanted someone to treat the topic sensitively, in the way that like social problem pictures would, and they were probably very, very. I haven't done the research myself into this, but I suspect they were very, very suspicious of Monogram, given Monogram's reputation for these kind of cash and exploitation movies, how they would deal with this subject, and there was that. Obviously, Mirisch has talked about the big battle he had with the censors at the time, and you're right, it does seem very odd. They say, okay, you have drugs on screen. I think wasn't it something to do with Britain allowing drugs to be represented on screen that maybe grease the wheels a bit for the PCA to allow that to happen, because they're very sensitive about the films that are going to be blocked in British territories, But I'm sure it must be to do with, the worry that what Monogram could do with this topic, So they wouldn't have minded so much, if something like Man with the Golden Arm, maybe a bit less out there than Man with the Golden Arm, but some kind of more serious-minded film was dealing with the subject than grubby little Monogram. I'm sure they weren't very, very keen on what Mirisch would have done with this subject otherwise. Did you get some sense of what Mirisch wanted then with the film?
He definitely wanted to show more about the narcotics. He was very disappointed that he didn't get to explore the topic, he felt.
Yeah, because that review I quoted, made clear, it doesn't need to be drugs. It's very weird that he's fed drugs in a drink, isn't he, or something? And then you've got the guy at the very end who's like, we're told he's been taking cocaine, In
the story, he snorts it.
Oh, okay, yeah. I imagine though that it's that idea about like not having anything in the film that young people could emulate. So it's that whole idea of like, okay, we're going to tackle this sort of topic of drugs, and now we're allowed to, but you can't have anything that's going to make it clear what it is, So it's really it could be, it's this kind of generic thing about like loss of consciousness or loss of control over the self, and loss of identity, rather than anything specifically about drugs, perhaps.
Just one little thing too, they also change it from a man giving him the cocaine in the story to a woman giving him the cocaine, and I, wonder if there was any worry about homoerotic implications.
Well, there may be. A lot of critics have had a field day with making a connection between Woolrich's closeted homosexuality and these films. Films like Nightmare and Fear in the Night, for example, often really having homosexual subtext. And there clearly are. It's interesting. I'm noticing a number of these Woolrich films with guys. I think Anne Douglas talked about this the other day. Guys lying on beds. But I think this is kind of torpor this involved, rather than necessarily seeing it as a kind of homosexual subtext. But these are men who are unmanned one way or another. So I think it's pushing the envelope a bit too much if you're going to say, oh yeah, this is obviously some kind of subterranean gay theme going on here. I think it's much more to do with these kind of listless heroes these heroes who don't lack any self-determination, who represent a kind of masculine deficiency, you know. So I think this becomes something that's a worrying aspect in the narratives, you know. Why is this guy so weak? Fear and Night is a great example, you know. It's like the Dr. McCoy from Star Trek, you know. It is an amazing performance, just not being able to connect, and there's an interesting relationship between him and the tough cop, who's obviously affronted by this guy who represents his big masculine insufficiency. So I think it's more to do with that. And I think there maybe is this idea of it is safer to have a woman seducing the man than it is to have a man seducing the man, or the man kind of invading another man in drugs. So there might be some kind of anxiety around this, the potential implications of that. There's at the very back, I think, this one.
Hello. So I'm wondering, because given the number of B movies that were made at the time, and then also the fact that they were operating on such a low budget, I'm wondering what the incentive for the studios would have been to buy the rights to a novel and then pay a screenwriter to adapt it, as opposed to just coming up with an original story for a B movie.
Well, I think with Woolrich, it's the name. You know, I think it's very much certainly by them when Monogram makes these films. Yeah, Woolrich is. I mean, those clips I played you from the radio programs are only a small slice of what there is on the radio. Woolrich's name was being beamed into homes every week, and he was somebody who has a USP, which was this kind of like intense suspense thriller. So I'm pretty sure they wanted not just to make that kind of story, but to capitalise upon Woolrich's name. Interesting enough, out of the three Monogram films, I think it's only The Guilty that doesn't plug Woolrich's name on the poster. I think they plug in basically the name of Jack Rather, who's obviously an egomaniac. Didn't anyone know about Jack Rather? I think didn't he become one of Reagan's Inner Circle or something later on? So I mean, but the other two films, Fall Guy and I Wouldn't Be in Your Shoes, are very much got Woolrich on the posters. And if you look at the posters for Phantom Lady, the Phantom Lady sides against the book. So we've got a very strong sense of like Woolrich is somebody who will draw punters to the cinema, basically. So I think they would want to pay, and also because it was short stories, they're not going to be that much compared to a whole novel, you know. So I think they can get hold of this material really cheaply, they can capitalise upon Woolrich's name, and they've got a product in one way or another is distinctive on a very low budget.
We'll have to end it there, but please join me in thanking Frank.